Okay, probably let us start. So it is my big pleasure to welcome everyone in this room and also online to this sort of lunchtime event, Measuring Peace in an Interconnected and Unstable World, which has been organized by my division, Accession Division, in collaboration with the Institute of Economic and Peace, IEP, our important partner for the Trade for Peace program. So my name is Maiko Shikawa, Director of Accession Division, which oversees implementation of a Trade for Peace program in the WTO Secretariat. So I would first of all warmly welcome Steve sitting next to me, Steve Kiela, founder of Institute of Economic and Peace, to the WTO for the first time, although he actually came from all the way from Australia, Sydney, Australia, although I have been told that he has been traveling in this region. I think we had several encounters virtually, but this is the first time he's sitting next to me in person. So it's really, really nice to have you, Steve, in Geneva. And I also like to welcome Simon Evenet, Professor of International Trade and Economic Development from University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and then founder of a Global Trade Alert. And I think who needs no introduction in this building. And thank you very much for coming from St. Gallen this morning, taking the train. And then, of course, I'm very happy to have my boss, Deputy Director General Zhang Xianqian, who has been great support of our work on Trade for Peace, and then Mustafa from Knowledge Management Division, who has been really a key member of our Trade for Peace team in the Secretariat. So I think at this point, probably I don't have to say anything more. Let me first invite my boss, Didi Zhang, for the welcome remarks. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Maika, Steve, and Simon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. Trade for Peace has been part of the WTO's transformation journey and the leadership of Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala to make the multilateral trading system work for people, including those in states classified as fragile and conflict affected. To deliver this vision, collaboration and partnership have been at the heart of the Trade for Peace program to better address the need of those countries, many of which are in the process of accession. The Institute for Economics and Peace has been one of our most important partners. Steve, it's a real pleasure for us to finally have you in person at the WTO. In my short introduction to kick off today's session, let me say a few words on the Trade for Peace program, where we are and where we want to go with our partners like IEP. I also hope that our good friends, Simon Evenet, a prominent trade economist, a world-renowned academic, and a friend of the system, can give us ideas on how the WTO can contribute to addressing the global challenges of fragility, especially regarding peace and stability. Let me start with the number. Today, almost 1 billion people live in fragile and conflict-affected states, nearly double the level of 2 decades ago. In those countries, fragility, conflict, and poverty often form a vicious circle, each driving the other. According to the World Bank, it is estimated that 60% of the world's poor live in fragile and conflict-affected states. DG Dr. Ngozi said at last year's public forum, our common future demands on we break these circles. This is a role here for trade. The DG also reminded us that trade and peace are completely intertwined in the history of multilateral trading system. For several decades after World War II, the system provides an enabling environment to promote peace through economic integration and growth. Looking at what's happening today around the world, I feel strongly that a serious debate and the thinking are needed to explore the nexus between trade and peace. The Trade for Peace program was born out of an initiative from a small group of fragile and post-conflict LDCs associated with the WTO accessions, which had been the vision to use the WTO framework to build policy and institutions that can foster peace and stability in their countries. This includes Afghanistan and Liberia, which were the last members to join the WTO in 2016. But also countries which are in the process of joining, including Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Timor-Leste, so on and so forth. Their visions to use trade for peace has been shared and embraced by other existing governments, especially those in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East, but also by WTO members, which are classified as fragile and conflict-affected states. Let me add that the two LDCs, which are now on track to hopefully join the WTO at the next ministerial in Abu Dhabi, are both FCS using their accession-related reform to promote stability in their countries. The Trade for Peace program is implemented through 4 pillars. The first, political engagement and partnerships. Second, public dialogue and outreach. Third, research. And fourth, training and capacity building. During the last 5 years, the Secretariat has carried out a number of activities under each pillar, often in partnership with partners from the peace community. Since last year, our focus is very much on the research pillar. The IEP is one of our key partners in this effort, especially in the development of Trade for Peace report. Since 2019, the IEP has presented the Global Peace Index in the WTO and the different formats. The LEP's seminal work in quantifying peace is essential to deepening our understanding of peace dynamics. This work is particularly important given today's global context. This interconnected and unstable world is rapidly changing, and we need to stay on top of these changes. The GPI allows us to track global trends, regions at risk, and the countries in need to help. Through our collaboration on the development of Trade for Peace report, based on data-driven analysis, we hope to better understand the economic value of peace and how trade can play a role in developing peaceful societies. According to the last GPI, the global economic impact of violence is enormous, $17.5 trillion or 12.9% of global GDP. And this impact is particularly concentrated in the countries most affected by violence. The key question is, how can trade be a positive force, creating economic opportunity and employment, and building mutually beneficial relationships between people and communities, which trade with each other rather than an active force, which may perpetuate the vicious circle of conflict and violence over the control of commodities and other natural resources. As a global trading institution, of course, our focus is to ensure that trade plays the positive role. It is our hope that our collaboration with the IEP can shed light on this critical issue. In addition to the development of Trade for Peace report with IEP, the Secretariat is undertaking additional research work. This includes the first publication on Trade for Peace, with the help of our former Chief Economist Patrick Lowe. One project focused on the use of trade policy instruments during the conflict and post-conflict, and another project looking at trade clauses in peace agreement and the peace-related clauses in trade agreements to get a better understanding of the role of trade in peace negotiations. From my discussion with peace negotiators, trade and resources management are often central to peace talks, and more research is needed to understand how these negotiations should be done. These projects will pave the way for more research on the trade-peace nexus and inform our future work. With this remark, I look forward to today's exciting conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DDG Zhang, for providing introduction to the Trade for Peace program. Especially, I think the focus that we are, putting emphasis that we are putting in the program, especially in the area of research, and then especially including with the collaboration with the IEP, and then, hoping that to produce some output in the coming period. And I hope that you finish your remarks, but I hope that you will stay with us till end of the discussion. Okay, let me probably turn to Steve to really share the main presentation on the finding of the latest Global Peace Index. And then maybe if you could spend about the next 15 to 20 minutes. I know it's a rich report, but I think it would be good to have a key finding so that we could have a interactive discussion thereafter. Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Mr. Zhang, for your comments. And the presentation I've got will take about 15 minutes. I'm just waiting for the changer and we will get underway. Voila, we're now in business. Right, okay. So this is the 2023 edition of the Global Peace Index. This is the 17th edition, which we've done in the last period of time. And given that creates an excellent backdrop for being able to actually study the trends of peace over time. This is not working. Okay. So the Institute for Economics and Peace was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace and economics, places special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, and then to ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. The organisation itself works with a, can we update to the next slide, please? So the organisation itself works with a number of different multilateral organisations. We do research for people like the UN, many different divisions of the UN, the World Bank, Commonwealth Secretariat, the OECD, and a string of other multilateral organisations as well. Place special emphasis on media. In fact, we did 47 billion media impressions last year. And we come in with an audience covering 152 different countries around the world. The work itself is recognised and used in thousands, if not tens of thousands of university courses around the world. And we have a range of different products. This is the Global Peace Index, but we also have the Global Terrorism Index, which is the leading measure of global terrorism internationally. We have other reports on the economic cost of violence, the global economy, others on the structures, attitudes and institutions which create peaceful societies, and many other products as well. Okay, all right, let's move into the key findings. So if we look at the Global Peace Index, constructed of 3 different domains. The first is measures of ongoing domestic and international violence. The second is measures of social safety and security. That includes things like the number of homicide rate. It'll include the levels of incarceration. It'll include violent crime rates, state-sponsored terror on its citizens, and refugees, IDPs, and the availability of weapons. The final one is militarization. It includes the number of armed personnel per 100,000 population, percentage of GDP spent on the military, and imports, exports of weapons as well. Now, all those 3 domains come together to create 23 indicators, which is the Global Peace Index. So this is a quick, we'd call it a mud map of the world. We'll give you an idea of the state of the peacefulness of different nations. If you look at it, red is very, very bad. blue is very, very good. You'll notice that most of the blue is in Eastern and Western Europe, which we'll come back to a little bit later. And we look at the red, other than the other than Russia, which is at the very top in the far right-hand side, we'll see conflicts are situated in South Asia, Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if we look over the last year, we find that peace deteriorated by 0.42%. That's literally the 13th deterioration in the last 15 years. So we can see more deteriorated than improved in most years. Now, 0.42% is fairly meaningless. But if we look at the number of countries which are improved, more improved last year than deteriorated. 84 improved compared to 79, which deteriorated. And what that shows is that quite often, what you'll see is that when countries fall, they fall much faster than what they do when they improve. Now, if we look at the improvements last year, we find that the impact of terrorism in most countries actually improved, although in a number of countries it did deteriorate markedly. Political terror scale, that's extrajudicial killings, torture, imprisonment without trial, that improved. And the expenditure of military as a percentage of GDP improved in many, many more countries than it deteriorated. And I'll come back to that later on because it's a long-term trend. Now, what caused the deteriorations this year, none of it will come as a surprise to anyone in the room. It's the number of deaths from internal conflicts and the number of external conflicts thought, deaths from internal conflict and political instability, and a lot of that relating back to the issues in the war in the Ukraine. Now, we go to the top of the index. Iceland remains the most peaceful country in the world. It has been the most peaceful country in the world for every year since the index has been done. And there are very, very good reasons for why it's so peaceful. Libya and Burundi had the largest improvements, both of them on the back of coming out of the conflict situations. Middle East and North Africa improved significantly. And that's for the third consecutive year. And so we can see the dynamics in the Middle East are improving. We can see relationships improving in a number of countries. We can see Saudi Arabia, for example, has improved its relationships with Iran, Kuwait. We can see a similar sort of thing happening with many other countries, including relationships with countries like Israel, which historically have been poor. Europe remains the most peaceful country, yet it recorded a deterioration in the past year, and that's mainly on the back of the Ukrainian conflict. So, Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful country. However, it did record one of the largest increases in peacefulness coming off the back of a prolonged war. Conflict deaths increased by 96%. And that's quite a remarkable increase. And that's after increasing by 48% the year before. Now, Russia and Eurasia recorded the steepest regional deterioration. Obviously, again, that was on the back of Russia and the Ukraine and the war there, and also the relationships with a number of the neighbouring states as well. And what we found is 6 of the 9 GPI regions in the world actually deteriorated last year. Only 3 improved. Now, if we go to the top of the table, what you'll find is that Iceland, as mentioned, ranks number 1. But when we look at it, what we find is 7 of the 10 countries are in Europe, if you include Iceland in Europe, and the other 3 are all over in Asia. So they're countries like Japan, Singapore, and New Zealand. We go to the bottom of the table. What you can see here, as already mentioned, Afghanistan's at the bottom. We can see countries like Iraq continue to improve. That was at the bottom of the table for many, many, many years. And Syria has also occupied the bottom of the table as well. We can see that it's improved somewhat over the time as well. what we can also see is that every one of these countries is engaged in conflict. And so again, that comes back to the debilitating effects that conflict have on a country. We look at the improvements. What we can see here is the 5 countries with the biggest improvements: Libya, Burundi, Oman, Cote d'Ivoire, and Afghanistan. And we looked at the biggest deteriorations, obviously Ukraine. We find that Mali also had substantial deteriorations, as long with Haiti. Haiti's obviously on the back of internal gang warfare and the collapse of the state. Israel, that's mainly on the internal conflict with the Palestinians, and also on the back of the increased political tensions within the country as well, and obviously Russia as well. Let's go now and we'll have a bit of a look at the trends over the last 15 years. And this is a fairly good indicator. So lines going up here are bad, lines coming down are good. And we can see that global peacefulness has deteriorated every year since 2014. Over that period of time, 97 countries actually deteriorated, while 66 improved. We look at the 3 domains: ongoing conflict, safety and security, and militarization. The one which has deteriorated the most is ongoing conflict. We can see safety, internal safety and security has deteriorated. The indicator which deteriorated the most in that domain was violent demonstrations, and it improved slightly in 2022, but if we go back over the last 10 years, that's been increasing every year. Now, contrary to what most people would think and imagine, militarization's improving in more countries than it's deteriorating, probably 2 out of 3 countries in the world. When we look into the details of that, there's no underlying driving reason. It's just in most parts of the world, we're finding that countries are prioritizing other expenses, which would be things like health, education, business stimulus, over expenses on the military. So we can find the percentage of spent on the military as a percentage of GDP has been decreasing for many, many years now, as has the number of service personnel per 100,000 population. Now, this gives you an idea of the various indicators in the Global Peace Index. One of the things which is really quite interesting is we can see the increases in conflict. More countries are meeting their voluntary commitments, the UN Peacekeeping Fund. And so that's the one which has improved the most over that period of time. Homicide rates have also improved as well. We go and look at the indicators which have deteriorated the most. It's violent demonstrations, and that's pretty much a global phenomenon and on every one of the regions of the world. That's followed by internal, external conflicts, for deaths from internal conflict and terrorism over the period of time which we've been doing the Global Peace Index. Now, there's something which is really quite interesting. Given the number of countries engaged in conflict, we tried to look for areas of the world where we could see which was interesting, which were improved. So if we go over and we look at the West Africa and look along the coastal region there, we can see that many of these countries have actually improved in their peacefulness over time. Now, what's more interesting is you can find these countries are hard up against Mali and the Sahel, which is probably the epicenter of global terrorism currently in the world. Now, what's interesting with Mali, which is one of the biggest deteriorators, it's got the highest number of deaths through terrorism, not one of the countries on the West Africa have actually had 1 death from terrorism. And so many of these countries have been in a conflict, like Liberia, for example, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. And so what we can see is that peace can be created from countries which have suffered in conflict. And all of these countries, if you start to look at their trade record now has improved quite dramatically over the last decade. So that relationship between trade and peace is important, one which is for countries coming out of a conflict, is exceptionally important in helping to build the resilience necessary to underpin further economic growth. And the economic growth through trade is actually works in synergy with the resilience of those countries. So now what I'd like to focus on is the economic cost of violence to the global economy. And so in 2022, that came in at $17.5 trillion. That's about 13% global GDP and about $2,200 for each person on the planet. Just to highlight this, you've got something like a bit under 60 countries in the world where the per capita income is 2,200 or less. Now, no one in this room or online could imagine a world which is 100% peaceful. We can imagine a world which is, let's say, 10% more peaceful. And that's the equivalent of $1.75 trillion. That's the equivalent of adding 3 new economies to the world, the size of Ireland, Switzerland, and Denmark. Now, if we look at where the expenses on violence goes, the 2 major ones are expense on the military globally and also internal security as well. That's mainly sort of in relationship to the cost of incarceration, cost of crime, and internal security services. So we'll come back and let's look at a few stats on the Ukraine. So what we can see here, this gives you an idea of the number of deaths from the Ukrainian conflict, and the numbers vary, with the very, very low side being 32,000, the upside being 130,000. And if we go over to the map on the right, we can see where those deaths have occurred, and we can see it's mainly along the eastern regions of the Ukraine, where the war's obviously been raging. And then also we can see it's scattered down, and particularly concentrating around Kiev. Now, how much does this cost? This is costing so far, about $449 billion. That's equivalent to 63% of the GDP of the Ukraine. What I want you to think about is the infrastructure in countries built up slowly over time, quite often 50, 60, sometimes 100, over 100 years and more. And it should get the destruction of the water systems and the sewage systems and the roads and the bridges to rebuild this stuff as 40, 50, 60-year efforts. And so the cost of violence is the destruction, other than the humanitarian costs, which we all focus on, is huge. What I want you to think about is, if we start to look at conflict, modern wars are almost unwinnable. They can be won, but they're very, very difficult. And what I want you to think about is the Russians lost in Afghanistan, followed by the US. We all know the outcomes of Iraq. Bashir is still running Syria. And we're looking at the Ukraine, which looks like it's moving into a frozen conflict. So we need new ways, and this comes with huge economic costs, which we're seeing. So we need new ways of being able to approach peace and be able to not fall into conflict. And I think the economic arguments around peace are key. And again, this comes back in to peace and trade agenda, and that the increasing the connectiveness of the world through trade, increasing the per capita income, building the resilience is key for future peace. And also the concepts of positive peace, those attitudes, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, one of the things with the Ukraine, which is of interest and I think really strategically important, if we look at the males in the country between 20 and 24, 64% have left the country or dead. Most of them are out of the country. 25 to 29 bracket, it's about 54%. So the ability to be able to construct a large army from the Ukrainian side is pretty difficult. We look at the females, you even got a higher level of people who have left the country. But we focus on the males because they're the ones who mainly fight. Okay, let's just have a look, and we're nearly finished with this. Let's have a look at the conflict trends and hotspots, and we'll move through this last bit fairly quickly. Violence increased significantly in a number of countries, Ethiopia, Mali, Myanmar, and the Ukraine, to name some. But on the other side, significant drops in Afghanistan and also Yemen, as we start to see better approaches between the number of the countries involved in the conflict. So now, we go back and we're looking at conflict was increasing prior to the Russian invasion. And so again, with total deaths rising 96% in 21, and the prior year it was up 45%. But if we look at those deaths in about 250,000 in 2022, 100,000 occurred in Ethiopia, 80,000 occurred in the Ukraine, or 83 to be precise. So now if we take those two conflicts away, it brings you down to about 70,000, which is about the average for the last 7 or 8 years. Now, since 2004, the number of international conflicts has jumped 9-fold to 27. That's a huge increase. Now, international engagement in domestic conflicts, is it a good or a bad thing? It's dependent on the actual situation you're looking at. So if you're ECOWAS involvement, let's say in the Sahel, you'd see that's good. UN peacekeeping missions, you'd also see as good. So you need to look at the individual conflict to work out whether this again can come from varies in different countries with different nationalistic lens, whether it's good or bad. The Institute for Economics and Peace doesn't make comments on that. Politically, we're neutral. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much, Steve, for very interesting, insightful presentation with a lot of interesting numbers that happy to open to any questions later on. But for me, the most interesting slide, which has always been the case in the last few years, when you look at the list of 10 least, peaceful countries, and well, since I do accession, and when you look at the list, half of them are in the process of accession, and I can actually put the 5 in the process of accession, 4 who actually went through the accession process, including Afghanistan and Yemen. And if you actually look at, bottom 20, I have even more. So this is a reason why in the accession division, because I'm often asked why you're doing Trade for Peace, but this is a reason why we have embarked on this Trade for Peace program. Because for this country, as the DDG Chan, really see, WTO and all the accession process is tough. All the reform effort that they have to put into it really will help them set the foundation to be able to foster stability and peace. So this is the reason why, we have started this program. At the same time, we still have some way to go. But also, I thought it was also interesting to see some of the positive developments, such as Libya, which is again in the process of accession, and then you also highlight Middle East and North Africa. That's where we have a quite large number of acceding government, but peacefulness is increasing, so that's also a good trend. I have lots of questions to ask, but before that, let me actually give the floor to Simon. So maybe to put perspective, probably as a trade policy economist on the presentation. Floor is yours, Simon.
Thank you, Micah. And let me begin by first congratulating Steve and his team for putting together this excellent report. I'm going to break out what I think are the different parts of it and talk a bit about it soon. But this is great work. And in the 21st century, being able to pull together this data all in one place and assemble it, process it, and share it globally is now possible. And I think you're obviously doing an admirable job in this respect. So well done to you. Well done also to the WTO Secretariat for having the vision to realize that, of course, the world has changed and we now need to explain the importance of openness and policies towards openness in a very different set of context than we had maybe 25 years ago. And we, of course, have had no greater reminder of that this week than with the developments with respect to the Black Sea grain deal, where if you needed any reminder as to why trade and peace are linked, the moment we have the potential for conflict, of course, risk premia on shipping goes through the roof, and private sector shipping companies are reluctant to go to ports which are potentially in conflict zones. So this week has served as an important reminder as to exactly why we must take this agenda very seriously. What I propose to do, and I'll go to my first substantive slide, please, is to go through 4 things. First, I just want to clarify for everyone, there's 4 different types of evidence found in this report. I'm going to focus later on 2 of them. But before I do that, I will talk about why I think a trade policy analyst should be interested in this report and the evolution of this report over time. So these are the 4 things I'll cover. Let me turn then to the 4 types of evidence which are on this slide on the screen you have here. So you've heard Steve describe the index that they have put together and the various findings, and I will say a bit more about that on the subsequent slide. And I think this is, of course, a unique contribution of this particular work, but it's not just limited to that. I think there's 3 other things to say as well. This report pulls together a whole series of different statistics on conflict and on peace around the world in ways which are both very easy to read and appealing, and also I think highly informative. And I'll give an example later. And I think that it's very useful to blend what others have found with one's own index. The third thing this report does, which I will spend some time on, because I do have some questions here, which is the estimates of the value of peace or the cost of violence. And in this report, it's almost as if peace and violence are treated as antonyms, that is, opposites. And I'm not entirely sure that that's right, but that's why we have a discussion here, right? There were different ways to pass this. Then the 4th thing the report does is it conducts a number of counterfactuals, which I'll say nothing more about, but I just want to alert you that there are some in the report. Very good. So let me then proceed to discuss the GPI 2023 on the next slide, please. Okay, we could go forward to the next slide. Excellent. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. I need to tell you why you should all take this seriously. No, please go to the next slide. So that's it. Very good. There are 4 reasons why I think we should all take this very seriously. And that is, as we've seen in the last few years, I mean, people talk about trade and peace and trade and war, and it's tempting to think about these things as binary events. But of course, as one looks over time in history, and even today, we actually have a continuum between peace and or stability and instability. And although peace and war sound like very extreme events on the extreme, we do move between closer to one and the other. And sometimes I worry, as we intensify geopolitical rivalry, that we're moving towards the wrong end of that spectrum. And I think we need to understand how these things play out, even as when we're away from the ends of the spectrum. The second thing is, as trade policy analysts, anything that affects production and consumption decisions will affect cross-border commerce. I mean, that is, cross-border commerce is the difference between production and consumption. So the moment that someone starts talking about a socially meaningful set of events like conflict, and the moment it starts affecting how people consume, what they consume, and also where firms are prepared to produce, we are in the business of talking about cross-border commerce. And so as a driver of what we are ultimately interested in, that is cross-border commerce in all of its forms, then trade and peace is a very important topic. And me breaking this between production and consumption almost hints at the different causal mechanisms which are at work. There's another causal mechanism, which of course is that conflict or peace can also affect the range of inputs to production that firms have and their ability to transfer data across borders. So there's almost three mechanisms immediately a trade policy analyst thinks of. Does conflict affect peace? Does it affect consumption? Does it affect how things get produced and delivered? Yeah. And so even at this stage, one begins to make connections between peace and trade, and then potentially trade policy. And that leaves me to the last reason why I think trade policy analysts should be interested in this work is, of course, we're interested in the types of win-wins which are out there, which is, are there policy actions that can reduce or deter violence and create commercial opportunities at the same time? And to make a historical example, perhaps the creation of the European coal and steel community over 70 years ago now was a great example of this, right? As a way of taking a certain set of factors off the table, and yet at the same time creating opportunities for cross-border commerce. And so that's one potential win-win. And I suppose the other thing we're interested in, or we could be interested in, is that once peace breaks out, how quickly does trade respond? And as trade deteriorates, how quickly do diplomatic relations deteriorate? So these types of interconnections, I think, should be of interest to us as well. So when I was reading the book, I had these four motivating thoughts at the back of my mind, trying to help me understand them. And maybe at the end, I'll come back to that, because I think one of the things I'd love to have seen more in the report is, if this is what trade policy analysts are interested in, how do we relate these rich findings to these types of questions? Okay, so that's how I came at the report and what I was looking for. If we could go forward, please, to the next slide. I can now turn to the interpreting the GPI. So if that's exactly the slide. Very good. So let's turn to interpreting the Global Peace Index for 2023. All right. Now, as Micah said, I run the Global Trade Alert Initiative, and we have never put together an index, because I've never been convinced as to how we take all the different multi-dimensional stuff that we do and put it together in one index, okay? And I've looked over time at how some other organizations have put together indices like the OECD, and I've often worried about two things. One, when one constructs an index, do you end up just validating what everybody thinks they know? So knowing that Iceland is a peaceful country doesn't shock me, right? And then that leads me then to the point, when can an index reveal something that surprises me? And I have an answer, which was in your report. So the example that you gave, Steve, from West Africa is the counterpoint, which is to say, there are things when you construct indices properly, there are surprising findings, or findings that people may not have learned. And that is, I think, where the value of indices come in, is if they can surprise the reader, not necessarily confirm everything they know. The second challenge often with indices is that, and especially for indices like the one we have here, is that the underlying variables don't change very much over time. So, Iceland may have been #1 now, and it's been #1 for a long time, okay? If it were a football league, we'd be very bored about that, right? No one wants to go and see the same team win every time, right? And so we have to worry about unchanging rankings over time. But then I thought harder about this. Maybe the way to think about this is, it's not the sheer ranking itself that matters, but there are certain key thresholds that once they get reached, we're either in the clear, in the safety zone, or in the danger zone. Yeah. And so maybe the way to think about, even though rankings don't change very much over time, though, it's when you get across these thresholds that we can start saying, wait a minute, this is a situation where trade could contribute more to peace, or where, if we're not careful, discord is going to lead to less trade, right? So I think that's a response to my initial concerns. The second point I had in mind is that, as you said, as you presented the GPI, you said the findings deteriorated by 0.42%, okay, which you said was fairly meaningless, and I would agree, right? But then I thought, how do we make it meaningful? Well, if there were reliable correlates between these GPIs, whether it's at the national level or the global level, and other indices that policymakers care about, like policy uncertainty indices consumption, GDP growth, or the capacity of governments to deliver services to their populations. These things could be ways in which you could say, right, the movement of this GPI in this direction means something because it correlates nicely with these other factors. So I was hoping that I was wondering if that would be a way to enrich the interpretation of the GPI. A third point which came out, and again, your great contribution is to put together the GPI in the first place, but since you have a team, you might want to ask how do trade, import, export, and FDI patterns change as the GPI evolves? So if we start seeing a country whose there's more and more either domestic violence or cross-border problems, do we start seeing certain types of trade beginning to dry up? These types of questions, or do we start seeing certain types of FDI drying up? And is this a warning to us? Yeah, and I think again, this might be another way of showing the value of this particular GPI. And then you could also turn this around. Do we start seeing, if we have a peace deal, and it's followed by trade, a lot of trade, does that increase the probability that the peace deal will stick? So then you've got a trade-related peace dividend. And so again, I think now that you've got this nice summary statistic or this GPI, there are lots of ways to use it. The last thought I had on how to use the GPI is that at the moment, it's very much a national characteristic. But if I were a policymaker, I would like to know not just what's going on in my own country, but are my neighbors deteriorating? So I wondered if some type of neighbor related indicator could also be constructed, right? So you might be doing all right, but the neighbors aren't doing so well, and that's a bit of a problem. Okay, think of our friends in the Baltics. Yeah. All right. So those are just some thoughts about how to squeeze more out of the orange that is the GPI. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next slide if we can. Now, then we come to the estimates of economic value of peace and the costs of conflict. So I've reproduced here in full what Steve and his team are trying to do, and it's quite ambitious. So they want to have the global economic impact of violence as defined as the expenditure and the economic effects of containing, preventing, and dealing with the consequences of violence. Okay, and the goal they have is to better understand the economic benefits resulting from improvements in peace. Okay, so that's two very different things. One is telling us what's the impact and harm created by violence, and then secondly, trying to tell us how whatever steps we take can result in less violence, I guess, and better benefits. And you can see here why I said earlier that I think the implicit assumption, at least in how this has been written up, it may be not in how it's thought up, but how it's been written up, is that peace and violence are antonyms, they're opposites. Okay, and maybe you can have violence but still peace. I know again different notions of domestic versus cross-border. I started getting a bit confused, to be honest. So I wondered a bit about that. Now, when you get into the details of the calculations, we have a bit of a classification problem, because let's take spending on law and order, which is counted towards the costs, but it could also, as I think the report rightly says, could be is a necessary expenditure to ensure a peaceful society. So is this a cost in the sense of harm done, or is this a necessary price that one has to pay in order to have peace? And that then leads me to the third point, which is on my slide, which is, would it have made more sense to differentiate between three things? The first is the costs of violence, including the opportunity costs of violence. That is, you could have lived in peace if you weren't fighting. And the costs of attempting to deter domestic and cross-border violence. And the third thing is the benefits of peace itself. Yeah. So I wondered if it would make sense to break this out so that this $17.5 trillion number can be broken down a bit. Because if I'm an economist, if you tell me there's $17.5 trillion worth of benefit on the table, I want to know how to get my hands on it, or at least I want someone to get their hands on it with good policy, right? And so that's a big number, and helping us understand, well, okay, how does that number break down? How much of it is conflict in a particular jurisdiction? And you talked about one of them. Or how much of it is money we're actually spending in order to keep the peace? That's important. And then I have this last question. Are these criteria MECE? My apologies for those of you who have never been to business school or taught in one, or have never been taught by me. MECE is a phrase which means, are the criteria mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive? It's used by consultants. And what it means, collectively exhaustive means, are these three categories the only three? And do they overlap? And I wonder if they might overlap, because the opportunity costs of violence could be the benefits of peace, which just tells you that I found it confusing to break this out. So if you and your team have had difficulties trying to break this out, you've got my sympathy, but I do think it would be very important and useful going forward if we could break the $17.5 trillion down, so that we know which levers we need to be working on. Okay, and that leads me to my last point, which is, if you put a $17.5 trillion number on the table, people do want to know, how can this inform decision making and the evaluation of the policies that that governments are actually doing now? And one thing the report is careful not to do, I think, or at least shies away from, is talking about what steps to take to promote peace or to diminish violence. And I think, even if one doesn't want to have a global answer on this, and maybe there isn't one because circumstances differ, maybe a couple of case studies showing measures which were taken which helped reduce violence or conflict in a particular context would help shed light on how this valuable cost calculation can move the needle in policy discussions. Yeah, so I think that would be my suggestion about how to make this even more useful for policymakers as well. And of course, for those of us who are interested in trade policy, we want to know in what ways can policies towards openness contribute towards reducing the costs of violence and increasing the benefits of peace. So that would be, that's the trade policy, international economics angle as well. So let me wrap it up there by saying that this is fabulous work, and I hope you keep doing it, and I hope you keep working with the Secretariat too, and that we can start putting on the table numbers which highlight why it is that nations need to start finding common ground in the wide range of different contentious files that are often being examined in this House as well as in other international institutions around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the very rich set of questions. And then all I can say is please join in our effort in the Secretariat's team in this research effort. I know that you're dying to respond, but before that, since Mustafa also need to go, could I first invite Mustafa, and hopefully can respond to some of the point that Simon raised, but also the kind of work that we would like to develop together with IEP. So Mustafa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maika, and thank you very much as well for inviting KMD for this important session. I would like also to congratulate Steve and Serge and colleagues from IEP for this great work. And of course, also to greet my DDG. Thank you very much, DDG, also for being with us today. And Simon, it's always very difficult to talk after you because you already capture many points I wanted to mention, but at least I would try to add new ones. Particularly how to incorporate the trade dimension. The trade dimension in measuring the cost of violence and the nexus between trade and peace, trade for peace. You will see that the literature is quite, important on this domain. In fact, I will try to focus my talk here on three main points. The first one is my assumption is that, of course, trade does promote peace. And you will see that from the literature, there are a lot of evidences, even though there are some caveats and some, policies that should be implemented, but at least, we try to mention this aspect. And I would like also to mention a quotation from our DG Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala in September 2021 during a Trade for Peace event, also that where DDG you were there. You mentioned that she mentioned that trade and peace are completely intertwined in the history of the multilateral trading system, and yet they are not often mentioned in tandem. Each has its own community, its own constituency. And I think it's important that we bring them back together and try also to develop a common framework to better understand, the contribution of trade to peace. That's why I'm going to focus on my second point, the rationale of a Trade for Peace report. And I will also, in my last point, try to bring some measures, some not indicators, but maybe parameters, variables that should be included in such a measure. The first thing I would like to mention before starting is the conventional idea. Trade does promote peace. And if you look at the literature, there are many evidences. As I say, larger trade flows lead to more peaceful relations. And this is highlighted in many works. You have some papers from Egri, O'Neill, and Russet, who have also mentioned the role of trade to promote peace. There's also the question of importance of the geographical structure of trade. And this is also some important part that your report, IEP, includes in some of your measure. The link also between comparative advantage, the nature and the structure of trade could also have a strong implication in terms of stability. And I think this one is also something that we want to mention. And the question of trade cost in the relationship between trade, peace, and conflict. I think also that Simon mentioned this aspect. Measuring trade cost is challenging, particularly non-tariff barriers, how to translate NTBs to ad valorem equivalence. And that's why the work, Simon, you are doing is also extremely important, because it does provide a lot of information to capture this dimension and the trade cost parameter. Technically speaking, trade does promote peace also when we include some gravity models. There are also some interesting, evidences on the literature, particularly when you want to analyze the relationship between, countries, the frontiers effect, the geographical dimension. I think this aspect is also very, very important. And positive peace promotion also is an effect of trade integration. I think, if you look at the Wiener theory, the regional trade integration theory, there is a positive peace promotion dimension in any trade integration work. But there's also the two-sided effect of trade on peace. And here, as I say, what we observed in the literature, that evidence that trade promotes peace at the bilateral level is only partially validated. Geographical structure of trade is also something that needs to be included. However, there is evidence that institutions and WTO memberships play a positive role in promoting peace. And I think this one is particularly important because this is really the strength of institutions and the role of institutions to promote peace. And that's why also there is a clear relationship between accession, rules of law, and promotion of peace. The other observation we can mention here is, if you look at the literature, and I think also there's a consensus here, the multilateral openness decrease global conflict. And I think this one is also something important to mention here in the WTO, that particularly multilateral cooperation is a clear driver to reduce global conflict. The last point I would like to mention in terms of setting up the sense about the role of trade in contributing to the peace framework is that trade, poverty, and peace remain also connected. I think it's not only trade for peace; it's also trade, peace, and inclusive development. And I think this one is particularly important if we also want to capture the poverty dimension, because at the end of the day, trade is not an end in itself. Trade is a way to reduce poverty. And I think it's something extremely important and mentioned in the Marrakesh Agreement of the WTO. So the link between trade, peace, and poverty is something also something that it's important to include in any thinking, particularly when we want to analyze the cost of economic violence. The World Bank estimates that by 2030, SDG years, up to 2/3 of the world's people in extreme poverty will be living in the 30 or so fragile and conflict-affected countries. And those countries also, many of them are acceding countries. So that's why also it's important to mention this aspect. So now let me come to the question towards a Trade for Peace report, and not really index, as you rightly pointed out, Simon. I think if we want to understand this link between Trade for Peace, we need maybe to also keep in mind some basic questions that I would like to recall here, and how to address those questions in a revised version of an IEP report. The first one is, first and foremost, to develop a robust theoretical framework that defines the contribution of trade to peace. It's not so clear. It's not so clear how trade contributes to peace, and I think that we need really to have a solid and robust, theoretical foundation to understand this aspect. Even though the literature does provide a lot of information, I think it's important really to agree on a common understanding. The second question I would like to mention here as well is case studies. Global, regional, national perspective. I think that, national, regional, global perspectives should also be clearly, included in any analysis to understand the contribution of trade to peace. One of the aspects also Simon mentioned is the baseline to define, because, the baseline obviously has some impact in terms of trend. And we need also to make sure that this baseline is relevant in terms of analyzing the contribution of trade to peace. The next question is the selection of trade variables. Which variables do we want to include to capture the contribution of trade to peace? You will see that in the literature, depending on the theoretical tools you are using, you could have various results. So that's why it's important also to have a clear understanding about the kind of variables, trade variables, to be included in analyzing the contribution of trade to peace. And I will try in my last part of the presentation to propose some typology of variables that could be captured in such analytical work. The other question is which peace indicator, the PPI, the GPI. I think there's also some interesting, difference here to capture, and the choice of the peace index also matters. And the last point is also very much related to the nature and the way to amalgamate all the variables. As I said, the rationale of the Trade for Peace report, is very much, relying on several points. The first one is the literature supporting the contribution of trade to peace, focus mainly on the contribution of the trade bilateralism and trade openness to interstate peace and security. However, the literature leaves unaddressed links between key elements of both trade and peace in different forms, particularly intrastate peace and security. How to capture, intrastate issues. Sectoral compositions of exports and imports, and the question of value chains, regional value chains, global value chains is also something that probably need to be captured in a very holistic approach. And there's unaddressed links are particularly important for LDCs and also for FCA, fragile and conflict affected countries. So that's why an holistic approach to the trade peace nexus is therefore crucial. In terms of way forward and what we'd like to do with IEP, because if it is also something that we may discuss during this panel, is the contribution of trade to internal and external peace. And I think this one is very much to analyze the correlation, various trade-related indicators with the peace-related indicators used in the IEP report and the GPI. And the second one, in terms of potential contribution, is to undertake as well trend analysis to better understand how the relationship between trade and peace-related indicators has evolved over time. And I think this one is also something important. My last slide is also a kind of response to Simon's presentation, how to capture the trade component. And this is what we try to do with colleagues. And I would like to also recognize the important work of Alex and colleagues from the accession division, Anais, Amanda, and all colleagues. This is what we try to capture here with the trade pillar. And the trade pillar, in fact, we think that there are 4 dimensions that should be integrated. The first one is the trade openness and integration. The second one is the macroeconomic stability. The third one is a trade-related infrastructure, environment. And the last one is much more related to trade welfare and the impact of trade in terms of poverty reduction and inclusiveness. And here there's also some interesting variables that could be used, and the work that you, Simon, you are doing with the global trade database could also be extremely useful. So I'm not going to detail all of them, but I just want to highlight some key elements. For instance, the question of WTO membership is something important. The question of diversification versus concentration to address also the cost of instability or economic violence, or determinants to analyze, the PPI and the GPI. Macroeconomic stability, obviously, this is something important. The CPI, Consumer Price Index. You are all aware about, the inflation and the impact of the CPI in terms of food insecurity. So this is also something that could be related to this kind of work. The current account balance, so it is very much, kind of macro perspective that need also to be captured. And this dimension maybe could be also more, let's say, present in analyzing the PPI. The question of also infrastructure environment, and here I would like to mention, for instance, the logistical performance index of the World Bank as an illustration, how to include, the cost of doing business, the trade cost, the cost to export, to import, the cost of business procedures. So this is all related also to the trade facilitation agreement that the WTO and members have negotiated some years ago, and reducing the cost of doing business. And last but not least is much more the question of inclusiveness, which is also a very important topic, how to include also the contribution of SMEs, enterprises, the question of employment. Is there a link between employment and unemployment, stability and stability? I think those aspects are also very important when we talk about social participation in trade and welfare. And also the question of food import versus export, particularly for net food importing countries. And we are seeing now with the issue with the Black Sea Grain Initiative that you mentioned, Simon, is something important also in terms of access to food security. I think I will stop here, but you will have the details of the Trade for Peace team. And my presentation or my discussion was also much more to raise questions rather than, to provide some answers to this important topic. But once more, thank you very much, and congratulations to this inspiring report, produced by a colleague in IEP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. And I do believe that your presentations in some way responded to, I think, Simon's last question had for WTO to think through. So we are thinking, as you see, and really together with the IEP, we have been developing this framework so that we could, approach this important question in a way that is based on, as you are doing, with the number and the evidence. Okay, I know that you probably, it's maybe I should give you back the floor to respond to probably some of the questions that Simon raised. And of course, please do feel free to respond to Mustafa's invitation to go in, letting our research project going forward.
Thank you, Makaya. Excellent critique from Simon. He posed some excellent questions. The first one comes back to the validity of doing an index. And so there are many indexes out there which aren't particularly good. The first thing for getting an index is to have a very, very clear definition of what you're measuring. So for the Global Peace Index, it's the absence of violence or fear of violence. That's the definition. And so that's a very, very clear one. Problem with a lot of indexes, as Simon pointed out, they can measure too many things, and then they end up measuring everything and just coming back to confirming what people know. So we're stuck with a very, very clear definition for the Global Peace Index. Now, so the advantages in this, I'll just give 3, and there are many, many. So let's think of the Olympics. No one remembers who came third in the 100-meter race, but they only came third by probably 0.01 of a second. So rankings are really key in terms of motivating change. And what we can see for a lot of countries, the ranking on the Global Peace Index matters to them. This then comes into their ability to be able to present their countries in a positive light. It affects, we definitely know this, affects tourism, the amounts of tourists which go to countries. There's a whole lots of stuff on tourism, which say the 10 most peaceful countries in the world to go to. Obviously, the ones at the bottom, they don't. Now, the thing which I think is most profound about the index is we've got about 50,000 different data sets we've used, but we can take the index and then we can do analysis against it, statistical analysis and some mathematical modeling to determine out the qualities which are most closely associated with highly peaceful countries. And that is the Positive Peace Index, which Mushaf has been mentioning earlier on. And now you can take that index now you've got the ability to be able to look at the factors which move countries towards peace or away from peace. But those same factors also are associated with a whole lot of other things we think are important. And getting back to trade and business, key one is a whole range of different macroeconomic factors. So countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating, on average, have 2% per annum higher GDP growth rates. Their interest rates are lower. Their inflation rates are lower. In fact, the inflation rates are 5 times less volatile. Foreign direct investments 3 times as high. They're more likely to improve in sovereign debt ratings, and the currencies are more likely to appreciate as well. So the index brings us around to that, but that's really important. But also countries which are improving, countries which are high in positive peace or improving in positive peace have better developmental outcomes. That's back to Trade for Peace again. Better measures on well-being and happiness, better performance on the ecology and many, many other things, and better performance on gender indexes, for example. There's a whole range of others as well. So that's just some of the uses and advantages. And you're right, at the top, they don't move very much. At the bottom, they don't move very much. And if you're putting that into systems theory, they're attractor planes. And in tractor planes, once you're in it, hard to get out of it. So being in the top's a great tractor plane to be stuck in. But when we move through other parts of the Global Peace Index, a lot of them move quite remarkably. You can see that because conflict can happen quickly. As conflict happens quickly, then you get changes. Political instability can happen quickly as well. So relationships with neighbourings is a measure within the Global Peace Index. I think Simon was saying he was more interested in seeing that. This was a short presentation. We do a lot of work around the relationships with neighbouring states. And we've done it looking around particularly Eastern Europe and the relationships, particularly on political stability, relationships with neighbours, and expenditure of GDP on the military sort of surrounding the Ukraine war, because that's quite topical at the moment. And now if we come back and I'm going to stop in a minute, but if we just come back and we'll just look at the economic cost of violence, and a lot of the queries which Simon raised there are excellent queries, and some of them are very good. So again, it's very ambitious, to use Simon's words, to put a cost of violence on the global economy. But it is worth doing to be able to bring home, and we can only count what we count. I think the cost is much, much higher because we can only count what we can count. There are a whole lot of things which we can't count, which are there. Examples that might be family violence, for example. Now, if we start to look at the countries, the top end of the Global Peace Index, their expenditure GDP on containing violence, which is the expression we use, is 3%. The bottom, the index, the bottom 10, it's 34%. So now it's right. A lot of expenditures, let's say on policing, for example, incarceration, and on the military to also actually create peace. But what's really important is the countries which need to spend the least amount of money on containing violence. They're the ones which have got the most economic benefit because the money can be used elsewhere. So you incarcerate someone in jail, it costs, let's say in a developed Western country, it costs about $60,000 up to $100,000 a year to keep them in jail. They're not actually earning money, which adds to the economic capacity of the country. So they're out, then that would be an economic benefit to the country. So the cost keeping them in jail. So the less number of people you got in jail, the more people you got as productive members of the workforce, the better the economic outcome is. So those costs, in many ways, you can take into account something like that. So if you're looking at it, let's say from a policing perspective, look at it from an incarceration perspective and a violence perspective. So those three domains, some of them, all of them come with a cost. The ones which you've got the list of each, where you need less police people, less police to keep the peace, less people incarcerated and less violence, the ones with the best economic outcome. And that's the kind of things we're trying to capture in it. But I agree, a lot more work can be done with it. And after this session's over, Simon, I'll get your business card and we'll have a conversation afterwards. And I'll pick up, you showed a couple of excellent things we can pick up and improve. And certainly when we come back to the comments I made on business and peace, we come back to Trade for Peace Index, we can see how strongly all this is interrelated.
Thank you very much, Steve. I don't know whether you want, would you like to probably say something? Well, Simon, they said fine. Okay, I have received a lot of actually questions. So if I may pick up some, it's almost no way that I could read out all of them. But maybe Simon, since I let Steve to take a bit of break. So, okay, from a different research project, we are looking at trade in a different forms. For instance, okay, we are looking at taxation, obviously that's from my team, trade policy instrument, agreement, food trade, SMEs, and all different factors. While all these can have a impact on peace, we want, we wouldn't want to spread ourselves in too thin. So as you are, very much the leading, WTO or trade expert, what do you believe are the main channels through which trade can affect peace? What forms of trade should we be focusing on?
So let me start by saying, I think one mechanism I would look at, since domestic peace, that is domestic political stability, is often triggered, instability is often triggered by inadequate food and essentials, then a sort of the trade, the secure flow of commodities and to developing countries, or actually to any country, quite frankly, not just developing, is extremely important, right? So one could think about and notice the logic here. If you're interested in peace, what triggers violence, the opposite, or instability, and then one of the episodes is access to essential commodities like food. A second, in a similar vein, but on the corporate side, and we have examples from history, we have the access or the ability to be able to import certain key energies and commodities as essential for peace. In fact, we've had countries go to war over this question. So I think that's another way of coming at this, which is to look at the triggers for instability, and then what are the different ones that we have seen in history, and then see whether they have whether or not trade has played a positive or a negative contribution there. And I think almost everything we know about embargoes has shown the negative side of this. Yep. Then I suppose to turn it around for post-conflict situations, getting populations fed, clothed, warm, all of these things, I mean, has to happen very quickly. No one wants to go through the winters of 1945 and 46 that Europe went through. These were pretty brutal times, at least if you read the history of that phase. And so trade can play a very important role in ensuring that the post-conflict era is something that people are more content with, and they can see that there's a material difference between the period now that the conflict is over with what they were going through earlier. I think that it's very important for making it stick as well. Yep. And then I think another area we have to think about is that some of the rivalries that we're seeing at the moment are over concerns about access to technologies and the like. Yeah, and how this creates enormous potential tensions, and to see how we can, to what extent the fact that technologies are shared helps reduce, or at least I don't mean shared as in given away, I mean commercially traded on reasonable terms, to what extent there's the sense that one has access to the cutting edge technologies and we're not being restricted in them. To what extent does that diminish suspicion between countries? And here again, I think the operative thing would be to work back for what are all the arguments used by the people who want to privilege national security, national economic advantage over openness. They have a list of fears which obviously keep these people awake at night. And then one would work back from that to see where trade can contribute to alleviating those fears. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your responses. I think it really tells how much, what these discussions are quite relevant and in the WTO also to think through the important contemporary issues. I know that we are getting close to the time, but there was one specific question asked to you, Steve, and I thought this is maybe interesting. Maybe. So you highlighted in your presentation, by the way, I'm picking this just because I also noticed myself. So this is also partly to respond to my question as well. So in your presentation, you highlighted that more people died due to conflict in Ethiopia than in Ukraine. But however, globally, while countries focus more on Ukraine, even if, itself, shows there's a greater casualty in Ethiopia. So anything you would like to share your thought on this?
Yes, so in the presentations we're giving, that's a question which comes up nearly every time.
Okay.
So there's a number of answers to this. firstly, the largest media outlets which distribute globally are centered around Europe. So if you look at the big channels for media, that's where it comes from. So if you look at the big news wires like Reuters, they're situated out of London. You've got EFE, they're situated in Spain. And then you've got a number of others as well. And they tend to feed the media out. So that's the first thing. There's not a lot of them associated in Africa. The second thing, which is probably as much of it as well, is with the Ethiopian war, access to the media and social media was cut off in the areas where there was a conflict. So there was not a lot of news coming out. And news services, news medias thrive on being information. Whereas with the Ukraine war, you've got a lot of journalists situated in there. You've got access to people in the Ukraine through mobile and social media, and also in Russia, to be able to get different points of views out. So that was the other contributing factor to it. But again, I think we were surprised when we first saw that, when we were doing the results of it. So there's one surprising result from doing an index. So that was we were surprised on it ourselves, and basically that's the conclusions we came to. Two things is, one, the distribution of media mainly coming out of the Western news wires, and secondly, the shutting down of the internet and the press, and the restrictions on any press getting in to the areas where the conflicts were occurring.
Thank you very much. I know that we are probably past time. Maybe if I could pick up a last question, then probably then we wrap up. Is that okay? Okay. So this is, I'm sorry. So first of all, really thanks to both of you and Mustafa for the presentation. You have made very informative, lots of appreciation for your presentation. So this question, so why violent demonstration has increased, and what are the factors behind the increase that, as it seems to be increasing regardless conflict affected, sorry, I'm not getting the question here. Okay, is there a way to factor in the economic cost of violence demonstration in the context of economic cost of a conflict? Does it actually make sense, this question to you? Probably I'm not capturing it right.
But I think the question about why there's more violent demonstrations is a really good one. Maybe Steve knows the answer.
Yeah,
Sure.
okay.
Okay, all right. You can no, that's fine. Yeah. Look, I think you hit on something really important there. And this is a phenomena which is happening globally, but it's also associated with a couple of other phenomena, which wasn't captured in this presentation, which is captured in the underlying studies in the report. So if we look at the intensity of conflicts and we look at the number of conflicts globally, they're on the rise, and they've been on a rise for 10 years as well. So you've got a factor which is happening globally, and you can see it in a number of different domains. So three of them: violent demonstrations, intensity of conflict, number of ongoing conflicts. And this is talking to something which is bigger and broader, and it's a trend which we can see, which is happening globally. Now, if we went back to 2014, 2015, which was an inflection year for global peace, and we've been seeing it's fallen every year since then. It's a number of things which happened around that year. So from that year on, what we found is that the number of people suffering from food insecurity has been increasing year on year on year. So if we look at that, that's an underlying factor which is sort of affects the security of a lot of people. We can see even within Europe, which I imagine a lot of people listening to this presentation was sitting in, we can see the factors of the underlying political instability and factors underlying dissatisfaction with governments. COVID was a factor which increased a lot of the demonstrations, a lot against that as well. And we can, if we're moving over into the developing world, you've got underlying factors there about resource scarcity. They're impacted by blowing overseas developmental aid. All that started to occur around 2014 as well. So you've got a number of complex factors coming in. So part of the key to this is improving and I don't like using the word the resilience of countries because it's now becoming a much overused word, and it's such a resilience in what, because there's so many broad categories of resilience. But we need to start to improve the resilience of countries on scores of different issues. And again, this comes back to the concepts of increasing per capita income. Increasing impact per capita income gives the ability for people then to be able to purchase more basics. They get a sense that their life's improving. And what is related to this then comes back to trade and comes back to economic empowerment and the ability of trade to be able to improve the economic lives of the average person in the countries. And all this, as we can see with the factors I mentioned earlier on with positive peace, and the relationship to economic development from increasing per capita income, lower inflation rates, lower interest rates, higher foreign direct investment, all comes and gets tied in together. But the factors for these increases in violent demonstrations, along with the intensity of conflict, number of conflicts, it's really, really strategic, and it's a varies from country to country, and they're very, very big answers. And a lot of it is the failure of a lot of the countries to be able to manage their domestic economic and political situations.
Thank you very much, Steve, for responding to that question. Let me try to wrap up. And then maybe if I could probably invite each speaker for 1 minute, and then really in that concluding remarks, if you could sort of give us where we should go next after this very rich conversation. Didier Tijan, maybe you'd like to start.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists, Steve, Sam, and Mustafa, for your excellent presentation. And I said to Steve yesterday that the Global Peace Index is a flagship public good of the global peace building initiative. And the WTO is a newcomer. And our Trading Peace Index and the report is just a small baby. So we will continue to rely on your support and your inside expertise to help us to have more understanding about the relationship between trade and peace. And we will, for the next step, to launch the pilot program in 1 or 2 countries to collect more information to establish the empirical linkage between trade and peace. But I'm confident that through this kind of collaboration, we can help those countries, the fragile and conflict-affected countries, in a concrete manner to help them to achieve stability and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Didier Tijan. Mustafa, maybe we take it from there.
No, thank you so much, Micah. Maybe 1 or 2 sentences. I think we have seen with this report the cost of violence. I think the narrative also should go to understand the benefit of peace and the contribution of trade to reach this prospect. And what I would like to highlight here is the necessity really to capture also the trade component in this dynamic, and also how trade and peace could support inclusive development. I think, let's be also focused on leaving no one behind and making sure that trade and peace goes together, as DG mentioned and recalled in September. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Maybe Simon?
So I know that you're going to do lots of case studies, and I think that's great. The other missing piece, which I see over the last few years, is we have an international business community which for years told us that they loved globalization and openness, and has much of which has gone very silent the moment that geopolitics and national security has come up. And so I think understanding why they have decided to prioritize other imperatives, it would be useful to know. Now, by the way, I don't want to overgeneralize, because I know of a number of senior executives who are very worried about this, but one is struck by how quietly so many of them have given up.
I hope they haven't given up yet. Steve.
Well, I think I've probably said enough. But I'll come back and just highlight one thing. When we're looking at modern wars, they're almost unwinnable, even for the most advanced military, when the people in the country don't want them there and they're well resourced. And so we need new ways of being able to articulate and think about peace. Positive peace, it's the mechanism, and truly understanding just how much conflict costs the global economy and how much better off. So if you look at that $17.5 trillion, $2,200 for every person on the planet, 58 countries, that's less than their per capita income. So when we come back to peace, come back to trade, it's exceptionally important for a stable global future.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think what I could say is really, I like to thank all the panelists who have stayed, and also all the audience who have followed us in the room and then online. For me, I think when we started Trade for Peace program, it was really, I often say this sort of came out of a little bit of accident, how we started Trade for Peace program, for those who knows the origin of a program. But what I'm really impressed is the richness of, the program, and also the whole depth of our conversation and in what we are having. And then in the beginning, we kind of, yes, this is us where, WTO or the GATT started trade and peace. But then I think today's conversation tells us a lot how contemporary this topic and the link is. And there's so much more, I think now it's so much more important to get into the research area. So really in this regard, I really like to thank Steve, but also Serge, because Serge was the first one reaching out to us, I think in 2019, when we first organized, one of the event. So it's really since then, I think our collaboration has really flourished. And I'm also happy to see Simon joining the conversation. And I really hope that we could build on the collaboration, the ideas. Lots have come up. I'm also looking at a little bit in this room. We have not seen before. If you are interested in this area of research, there's so much room to do exciting work. So I would like to also invite you. I'm looking at you and those who are also online to come on board. And I'm also looking forward for Simon's offer to maybe do a little bit of research work. And then maybe also for your information, we started, apart from the book that DG Jam mentioned on Trade for Peace publication, we're planning to finalize in the coming months. We are also doing a course at the Graduate Institute on Trade for Peace. And then we have other, exciting research project. So if you are interested, very please reach out to us. We'll be really interested in collaborating with you to take this exciting research agenda forward. With this, thanks once again, everyone, and then let this presentation, the session, to come to a closure. Thank you very much. Thank you.